We've talked about nations, and now we're going to talk about a supernation. Behold the supranational European Union, or EU if you're nasty. 27 countries, with one set of laws holding them all together. But no army, no taxes, and technically it's not even a country. But at the same time, it's a lot more than a simple trade alliance. And to really wrap our minds around all of this, let's look back at its history to understand why it is the way it is today. When people complain that the EU is too bureaucratic or moves too slowly, that's because that's exactly why it was created in the first place. To slow things down between countries that had spent the better part of the last millennium fighting each other. Flashback to 1951, only 6 years after the end of World War II that saw most of continental Europe destroyed. French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman had a simple yet deceptively complicated idea. Put French and German coal and steel production under one shared authority, so that war between those two countries would become not just unthinkable, but practically impossible, because coal and steel literally fueled these conflicts. That agreement became the European Coal and Steel Community in 1952, with 6 founding members: France, West Germany, Italy, and the 3 Benelux countries of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Those same 6 expanded the idea in 1957 with the Treaties of Rome, creating the European Economic Community, or EEC, a genuine common market that eliminated trade barriers. It created customs union and allowed the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people among its member states. Membership grew in waves over the 70s, 80s, and a large section of Eastern Europe joining after 2004. But in 1992, the member states took a massive leap with the Maastricht Treaty. It formally created the European Union we know today. It added a shared currency that became the euro and gave the Union authority over foreign policy and justice cooperation, not just trade. The most recent major overhaul, the Lisbon Treaty, took effect in 2009. And it's the closest thing that the EU has to a constitution today, folding the Union's founding agreements into what's now officially called the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. Britain famously left in 2020 with Brexit, bringing membership down to 27 countries, the first time the club has ever gotten smaller. But click here if you want a deeper dive into all that foolishness. The EU splits executive-style power across 2 very different bodies. The European Commission is the closest thing to a civil service and a cabinet combined. 27 commissioners, one nominated by each member state, that propose almost all EU legislation. This commission is led by a president, currently Ursula von der Leyen, from Germany, re-elected by the European Parliament in 2024. And she's arguably the most powerful individual in Brussels. That's the EU's capital as well as Belgium's. So if you're looking for a single head or leader of the EU, it would be her. But like everything else in the EU, it's complicated because there are multiple presidents. Separately, the European Council brings together the actual heads of state or government of all 27 countries, plus its own president, currently Antonio Costa. This body doesn't pass any laws on its own. It just sets the political direction and picks the Commission president for the Parliament to vote on in the first place. Speaking of that Parliament, everything in the EU's legislative process traces back to one election, the European Parliament, the only EU institution voters across all 27 countries actually elect directly. 720 members, elected every 5 years, one election held at the same time across the entire EU, but every country runs its own version under its own national voting laws. Seats aren't handed out purely by population either. Smaller countries get more seats per person than bigger ones, a deliberate design quirk called digressive proportionality, and it helps make sure tiny little Malta, with 500,000 people, has a seat at the same table with 80 million Germans. But here's a really big catch. The Parliament can't actually write legislation. It can only amend legislation the Commission proposes, and it can remove the entire Commission with a 2/3 vote of no confidence, sort of like a check on the system. And it has its own president, Roberta Metsola. Its partner in lawmaking is the Council of the European Union, often just called the Council. The closest thing the EU has to an upper house, made up of the relevant national ministers from each country depending on the topic. It has a rotating presidency that's currently with Ireland's government. For most legislation, Both bodies, the elected parliament and the appointed council, have to agree on the same final text before anything becomes EU law. It's also the only lever European voters, as a single political voice, get to pull directly on EU power, since every other institution is filled with representatives of national governments. The Commission, the Council, all of it traces its democratic authority back to this one ballot. The Court of Justice of the European Union, based in Luxembourg, is the body that keeps all 27 countries actually bound by what they signed up to do in the first place. One judge sits on the court from each member state, so 27 in total, and its rulings establish two principles that make the whole system function: that EU law takes precedence over conflicting national law, and that EU law can be directly enforced by individuals in national courts. Without these two rulings, the EU would just be a set of promises that countries could simply ignore, sort of like the UN. But with them, it's something closer to actual binding law. You know, like a country. One boogeyman that always gets floated around as a right-wing objection to the EU is that it would inevitably lead to a European army sweeping across the continent. And given the last 200 years of history, that's not a totally unreasonable fear. But it's pretty much also ancient history now. There is no EU or European army. Defense remains a national responsibility. So each member state owns and commands its own military, and any decision to deploy troops runs through the national capitals in Paris or Athens, not Brussels. But the EU does have its own mutual defense clause, on paper even stronger than NATO's Article 5. And like Article 5, it's been invoked exactly once, by France after the 2015 Parisian nightclub attacks. But for most members, real collective defense still runs through NATO. 23 of the 27 EU countries are also in NATO. The other 4 have stayed formally neutral due to cultural or constitutional obligations. But spending euros together isn't fighting together. And with Russia invading Ukraine in the east and threats from the US pulling out of NATO from the west, Europe is trying to figure out how to protect themselves without American military spending backing them up. To join the EU, a country has to satisfy what's called the Copenhagen criteria. It has to sit on the continent of Europe, run a democratically elected government, respect the rule of law, protect minority rights, and run a functioning market economy. Morocco actually applied to join back in the 80s, and it got rejected for one simple reason: it's in Africa. But even meeting all of these criteria doesn't guarantee admission. A country needs the Council to grant candidate status, and that vote has to be unanimous. Every single member state has to say yes. From there, negotiations open on 35 separate policy chapters called the Acquis Communautaire, and each one only opens and closes by unanimous agreement of all 27 members. That's the real bottleneck. You see, Ukraine opened accession talks in 2024, right in the middle of their war, but Hungary alone blocked its negotiating chapters from opening in the first place. 26 countries can agree on something, but one lone holdout still stops everything. As of right now, 9 countries currently hold candidate status, and Montenegro and Albania are the furthest along, both aiming to wrap up negotiations by the end of 2026. And in a pretty big twist for this series, there could be an anti-Brexit happening. Iceland, who applied back in 2009, later froze their application, but they're holding a referendum later this month on whether to restart the whole process, so watch this space for future developments. And here's the biggest difference compared to every other countries we've covered in Politics 101. National governments are still the layer below Brussels. All 27 countries kept their own parliaments, courts, tax systems, and armies, and only handed specific listed powers up to the EU. Brussels is only supposed to act when a goal can't be handled as well as by member states alone. But everything else, like healthcare, education, policing, that sort of stuff, stays entirely national. So when EU policy affects you, here's who's actually choosing who calls the shots. Parliament, direct election by the voters. The commissioners are nominated by their national governments, not elected by anyone. The Commission President, elected by the European Parliament, not voters directly. The European Council are national leaders who got there through their own country's national elections. The Council of the EU are national ministers appointed by their home governments. The Court of Justice are judges nominated by member states. And just to confuse everyone, the Council of Europe is a totally different thing. Not part of the EU at all, but they all share the same flag, for some reason. So when you want to blame someone, a commission rule is Brussels doing its job, backed up by the national governments. A passed law needed both your elected MEPs and your own government's minister to sign off. Anything about healthcare or schools, stuff like that, it's never Brussels' call to begin with. And whether a new country joins is entirely up to the existing members unanimously. And the same goes for all the big European policy decisions. Every country has to be in favor of it, because after all, it's a union of sovereign European countries. That closes out Politics 101. Subscribe if you're into this sort of content, and scan the rest of this playlist to see how the US, France, Germany, and the EU's frenemy, the United Kingdom, actually function. And if you're watching this in the distant future and things have changed and we've survived the robot uprising, let me know and I'll do an updated version. See you next time.